Hello, everyone. Happy Monday to you all. I'm Amanda McCrossin. I am joining you live for this Open the Cellar virtual session. We are going to be taking a look back 10 years to be exact at the 2014 Napa Valley vintage, which I'm so excited to revisit today. We are doing this via 4 wines, 3 reds from 3 distinctive AVAs, and a white wine, a wine that not a lot of people really know that we can be drinking with a little bit of age on it. And I have to tell you, I got a sneak peek of it earlier, and it is dynamite. This is from one of our classic producers in Napa Valley. I am here with 4 of the winemakers who have been with these wineries, who are representing the wineries we are drinking today. And if you are watching, and as we're tasting, you're like, hey, that sounds really delicious. I too would like to drink these wines. Well, you're in luck because these wines are actually available for a very, very limited time via openthecellar.com. So starting today, running through October 21st, a full week, you have the opportunity to visit that website where you will find a list of these wines along with tons of other 2014 Napa Valley gems for sale. This is a rare opportunity for you to dive into the libraries of the Napa Valley wineries and get these wines direct from them. So I encourage you to definitely take advantage of that because the wines that we are drinking today are phenomenal. And this is a great way to revisit a fantastic vintage in Napa Valley. This is a vintage marked by high quality. It's marked by depth of flavor, near perfect weather, an abundant crop. And I've got the 4 winemakers with me today. And I would love their thoughts on the 2014 vintage. I have my own thoughts, but I would love to introduce to you the 4 winemakers we have with us from Grgich Hills. Ivo Jeramaz, how are you?
Doing well, thank you.
We've got from Inglenook, Jonathan Tyer.
Hi, thank you.
From Honig, Ashley Egelhoff.
Hi.
And from Chimney Rock, Elizabeth Vianna.
Hello.
You guys have all taken a very quick break from harvest. Well, some of you took a quick break. Some of you were actually wrapped for this 2024 harvest. So congratulations on that. Before we get into the tasting of these 4 wines, we're going to give each of you the opportunity to talk about the wines I'm tasting with you today. I just would love your quick perception of the 2014 vintage. Anything that stands out to you as something you'll always remember?
Who should start?
You should start, Ivo.
Thank you. I'm still rattling. It was a rattler earthquake. It
That's
was
right.
harvest of earthquake before we started. And unfortunately, 2013, which is considered one of the best vintages for red wine, many small producers lost lots of 2013 in that earthquake. But we had to go on, press on, and start harvest. For what I remember is that even though we are talking about 2013, the lowest rainfall on record, yes, from January to December, but in December 2012 we get lots of rainfall, so plants had plenty moisture for vintage 2013. For me, a really drought year is 2014. So we got about 12 inches of rain in Carneros and American Canyon where we grow these grapes. Other than that, we call it uneventful harvest. That's what we want, or season, no heat spells. In old days in France, harvest is ruined by excessive rainfall during harvest. In Napa Valley, overwhelmingly, harvest is ruined by excessive heat during harvest, and we had none of that.
And we were about 2 weeks ahead of schedule, if I'm not mistaken, for a lot of the wineries. It was even reported that a lot of the winemakers were able to get home in time to trick or treat with their kids on October 31st. They were barreled down so they could have Thanksgiving in peace. It was marked as July 30th was some of the first fruit to come in for sparkling and a little bit for white wine. And then the red grape harvest began the 3rd week of August and concluded by the 3rd week of October. Which is pretty crazy. Although I will say, I just spoke with a few of you before this, and it sounds like a few of you guys are in already for this harvest. Anyone else want to add anything before we dive into this delicious white wine?
Sure.
It was a really early harvest. We finished on October 8th and 14, and this year we actually finished on October 9th. So very close finish dates.
Wow. Interesting. Jonathan?
I was just going to say it was a very generous vintage for quantity and quality. And to Second Elizabeth, it was a very early vintage. We actually started picking reds at the end of August that year.
Wow. Wow. And interesting that the third year of drought. So it was considered a drought vintage, fresh off the heels of the 2013. I remember serving the 2014s at press, and I remember the crossover from the 13s to the 14s as the 13s being very opulent and sort of, very generous, lots of fruit, kind of these plushy, lovable wines. And then the 14s arrived, and you could see that they were sort of similar. There was some relation there, but the 14s were this sort of stealthy, more like introspective vintage. Like if they were sisters, you had like the big, the popular, very vivacious 13, and then its sibling was like a little bit more reserved. And so I remember when I served those 14s thinking, it'll be interesting to see where this is in 10 years, because I think that potentially the 14 vintage, even though people really love the 13 vintage, I think the 14 vintage could be the more long-lived of the two. So I am curious to see if that theory is correct. And I think without any further ado, let's jump into our very first white wine today. Chardonnay is not a wine that people always recognize as being age-worthy. And you certainly cannot talk about Chardonnay without talking about the producer that we are going to be drinking today, which is Grgich Hills. Some of you may recall Mike Grgich, who was the founder of Grgich Hills, as having a hand in a pretty important thing that happened in 1976 called the Judgment of Paris. And since then, and starting his own winery in 1977, Grgich Hills has really been an icon for great Chardonnay in the Napa Valley. And so I'm very excited to taste this today. We are with Ivo, as I mentioned, who is Mike's nephew and who has been with the winery now for almost 4 decades. You mentioned a few anecdotes about the 2014 vintage, but what can we talk about in terms of the 2014 vintage and how this wine is drinking today? Because I'm noticing some golden color, but this is still really bright and really fresh. And even though it's got 10 years on it, it still feels like fresh as a daisy.
Well, thank you again for organizing this and inviting us to participate. Yes, most people don't age Chardonnay. Even there was a crisis in France, premature oxidation. Now I hear that even great the Burgundian Chardonnays are not being kept too long.
Mm-hmm.
There are secrets to make Chardonnay that will age gracefully. First one, you have to have natural acidity. And natural acidity you get through farming. So all our vineyards are certified organic and are regenerative. So microbes in soil help plants provide plants with all nutrients necessary. Second little secret is, when I started 39 years ago, Mike would whip me if we did not put enough sulfur to keep a juice green. So a juice was protected like holy cow with sulfur, not to oxidize. That was always. Then we discovered, actually, it's not a bad idea to oxidize Chardonnay juice. Now we put no sulfur until 2 months into wine, and we oxidize all these phenols and remove them from the Chardonnay, and then later on, that's what turns brown in your glass in 10 years after. So those are 2 secrets. Some people say there's no difference if you use tartaric acid from the bag or tartaric acid that you find in grapes. I disagree with that. I think natural tartaric acid that plant creates is different than tartaric acid from the bag. So if you want to have beautiful Chardonnay to age gracefully, you have to have natural acidity. So this one comes with like 6.7 grams, which we feel like it's a perfect amount of acid. pH is only like 3.25. Sorry to be a little geekish with numbers, but it's important.
Yeah.
And you notice color. I say this is daffodil color, so it's appropriate for this age. But there is still green hue in it. This vintage was not as plush as 13, so it's a bit more chiseled, more mineral, which I love. And again, the result is wine. We can all argue, is 3-year-old Chardonnay better than 5 or 7? It all depends on what you like. I like personally aged wines, whites and reds, and you lose youthfulness after 5 or 7, 10 years in this case. but there is so much more complexity. Now we call this what we get bouquet. I love a bouquet of aged wine.
This is a remarkable wine. I think, you know, when people think of aged Chardonnay, they don't really know what to make of it. And, you know, the progression of Chardonnay as it ages, it will start to gain a little bit of color. You can see it's a little bit more golden. It can start to take on some of these nutty qualities, and it can lose its freshness. But what I'm finding in this glass, which I think is just so stunning, is, as you mentioned, the freshness, the acidity of this wine is just stunning. I mean, it is front and center, but you're still getting a little bit of that marzipan thing just slightly underneath. Where would you say the trajectory of this wine is going? How much longer until you feel like, I'm not so sure as this is going to be a wine that I want to drink?
I believe 10 more years. And when people ask me, oh, what year this wine will be best? I said, oh, same thing if you ask me, what year you were best? What do you mean? What year I was best? I had the highest vertical leap. I was a basketball player when I was 21. Now it's down to 3 inches. I look much better when I was 21. Now I don't, but I have 10 times more wisdom. So it's up to you, dear consumer, to kind of have your own liking. And there's wines are pretty 3 years old, but also they can be very pretty 10 or 20 years old.
I think this wine will still be gorgeous in 10 years. I think if anyone is watching this and curious about what an aged Chardonnay should taste like, this is a perfect example. I mean, it really could not be in a better place right now. And I think you're right. It only has 10 more years, even more than that, to continue to blossom and improve what is already a stellar wine. One thing I do want to mention, because this is something that I think not a lot of people realize, you know, this kind of wine is incredibly pairable with lots of different foods, even your red proteins. And I say that because sometimes we get steaks and sometimes a red wine feels a little bit too opulent. An aged Chardonnay is absolutely beautiful with the steak, especially when it's dry aged, especially when it's got a little bit more marbleization. So do not discount an aged Chardonnay when you're pairing food and what it's capable of, especially when it's one like this that's just showing so well right now. So I do want to, I'm going to set this down and I'm going to revisit it because I know that I want to drink more of it. But I'm going to jump into some red wine via Jonathan Tyer from Inglenook. This is another classic. It dates back a little further than Grgich Hills, back to 1879. It's got a long storied history that someday I hope maybe like Francis Ford Coppola or one of his filmmaking family talents might turn into some epic film. But I am sure glad today to see what has been happening at Inglenook over the past few years, and glad to see Jonathan Tyer, who is the winemaker there. And I think these wines from Rutherford are just fantastic and such a classic example of the Napa Valley, but also I think representative of the vintage. So I'm excited. I haven't actually tasted this wine yet, but I'm very excited to. I know you started at Inglenook in 2015, but I know that you're familiar with the vintage, and I'm sure you probably had a very big hand in blending the wine in front of me, which is the Rubicon and sort of the premier wine of the estate.
Absolutely. I actually joined Inglenook right in the beginning of January in 2015. I played a part in every part of this wine except fermenting it. But I'm very familiar with the 14 vintage, having worked in the area that year. Rubicon is always from the back of our property. Our property, we have about 1,700 total acres here in Rutherford, and about 235 acres of that is under vine. The vast majority is all Rutherford bench. It's all alluvial fan soils in the back of our property. And that's always where Rubicon comes from. It's always the best expression of the Rutherford bench for every vintage. One thing that we've done here, our director of winemaking is Philippe Pascal, and he had implemented us picking earlier. And in 14, we actually started a harvest on August 29th and concluded September 27th. So these are all picking earlier, trying to really capture that freshness, and also really picking when we feel the grapes are phenolically ripe and not waiting too long to get the higher sugars that can happen as well. So trying to pick this on the earlier side.
I think the attempt to create a wine that really shows freshness is encapsulated in this glass for sure. I also would like to pat myself on the back because I feel like this wine since I last tasted it so long ago has really just come a long, long way. And I do think that the 2014 vintage is one that is going to age a very, very long time. I assume you've checked in on this wine a time or two before this. What has been the evolution of this wine, and what have you seen in the glass that you maybe weren't seeing previously?
Absolutely. It's, watching this wine from its youth through today, I actually thought this would be a younger drinking vintage when comparing it to the 13 and 15 vintages, both being a lot more expressive and opulent. And then now, after 10 years, it's just absolutely stunning. It's really showing its freshness. It's got some great tertiary notes starting to happen on it, but it's still showing a lot of youth to it as well. So I think this wine still has a long time before it's going to peak and start going down the backside of it.
Well, you certainly have a nice collection of dust-covered bottles behind you. So a long history of aging wines at Inglenook. What's your take on this wine? I mean, to me, I've tasted the Inglenook wines, luckily back to the 50s, and they're still stunning. And I think this is an example of a great site and great winemaking and an excellent vintage coming together on one glass to make something incredibly age-worthy. What's your bet? How far is this going to go?
I would say this is going to go for at least another 20 to 25, if not longer.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And I think what's really fun about the 10-year mark of especially Napa Valley wines is it really starts to become this wine that can kind of be for a lot of different people. As you pointed out, there's still so much of those primary fruits. It's really just kind of jumping out of the glass, and it's really fresh and very, very fruit forward, but also has all of this savory tertiary, secondary characteristics that we love so much about aged wines with those softer tannins. It's really just sitting in a very, very pretty place. And I will also say, I have not decanted this wine. I have just let this sit in the glass for the last 20 or 30 minutes, and it is just perfect already. I am curious before we get to our next one, do you have a take on decanting, especially since we're talking about older wines?
We don't typically decant here. We went through and tasted a Rubicon vertical, and the 78 and 79 were great right out of the bottle.
I'm with you. I think there's a time and a place for decanting, but if you have the time to just enjoy it over the course of a few hours, highly recommend. I think this wine is just showing perfectly right now. I think it's a great example of what's possible in the Rutherford bench over there. And I'm super excited to see where it goes in a few years as well. I'm having the best time, guys, because I get to drink all of these wines. And for those of you who are just joining, if you want to join in on the fun, all of the wines that I'm tasting, along with lots of other 2014 vintages, are available via openthecellar.com for a very limited time until October 21st. I'll also mention that we are going to be opening it up for questions at the end of this segment. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat and we will get to them at the end. But for the time being, I am going to jump to the other side of Rutherford to Honig Winery, but that's not where we're going to be tasting the wine from. We're going to be tasting it from Knoll, which I'm very excited about. So please welcome Ashley Egelhoff, who has been with Honig since 2012 when she started as an enologist there, and she's since then been promoted to winemaker. I think is your entire winemaking team on the leadership side female? Is that correct?
Yes, we're currently a 4 female winemaking staff, which is pretty cool. Yeah.
That is very cool. People always ask me, like, are there a lot of female winemakers in Napa Valley? And I love seeing 2 represented here, but I love seeing on your website 3 women just listed right down the center. It was very exciting. Ashley, I'm sure starting there in 2012 as an enologist and then working your way through, you've seen a lot of different changes. I know Honig is really big in the sustainability front. What do you remember about the 2014 vintage? Do you have any specific memories from?
I do. So I had my first child in June of 2014, and I actually brought him to work with me during harvest. So when we talk about 14, that's the first thing I think of is walking around with him, carrying him, tasting through tanks with him on the front of my chest.
That's amazing. And so your child now would be 10 years old?
Yep.
That's correct? Ooh. A little more difficult to carry around with you in the winery, but
yes.
still fun, I'm sure. This wine is not coming from Rutherford. This is coming from Knoll, which
Oak
I
Knoll.
would love for you to speak not only about the 2014 vintage, but also about this specific vineyard. This is the Rafael vineyard where it's coming from.
Yeah, so Rafael is in the southwest corner of the Oak Knoll district. And we made a single vineyard starting in 2009 from this vineyard. And it tends to have a bit more of Rhone-like characters than you would expect from a Napa Valley wine. It's not as opulent, it's more textural. It can even have some white pepper characters, which I feel like this is showing. This 2014 is really showing chocolate notes, kind of dried cherry. And I actually opened a 2010 Rafael this weekend just to see, because we had opened the 14 together on Saturday, the winemaking team, and really similar notes as well that really carry through this vineyard vintage to vintage, but also show kind of the different vintage impact as well.
I love the Rhone analogy. I think you're right. There is like a lot of black pepper here. There's a precision to this wine that just feels very linear like this. This is 100% Cabernet Sauvignon, is that correct?
It's 100% Cabernet, and it would have been 100% French oak, new French oak.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fun to taste these wines because, you know, it's not often that you get to taste 10-year-old Napa Valley wines, but also from all different places across the Napa Valley, which really showcase their respective terroirs. There's so many different microclimates and soils within the Napa Valley that we get to see. For you, where do you think this wine is going? I mean, this shows intense linear precision. I think if you compare it to the Inglenook that we just had, which had a little bit more opulence and had more shoulder, this really feels focused and like it's going to shoot an arrow right through it.
Yeah, I mean, kind of what Jonathan was saying earlier, I was a little worried that 14s were going to get lost in the shuffle between 13 and 15, which are two very talked about vintages and a little bit different than 14. But I think this is aging really beautifully, and I would say another 10 years would be interesting to see where it's at. I think it'll still be beautiful, and it could go further than that. I think at that point, it's kind of up to personal palate.
Yeah, I agree. And I do see there's a question there that I definitely want to get to at the end around what the difference is between 10, 20, and 30-year wines. So do stay tuned for that answer because I'm going to be asking all of you guys that. Yeah, I mean, you can feel that the tannins are still very much present. They feel stern in the bottom. So some of that drying feeling is really lovely, but they're soft right now. And I think as this wine continues to evolve, both in glass and both in bottle, that's going to continue to flesh out a little bit. We're going to continue to get even more of these beautiful secondary, tertiary notes. I'm just really, really excited about where these wines are right now and how much they're showing their respective place in addition to the vintage. So it's really exciting. I get really jazzed about talking about wines like this because it speaks to the quality of Napa Valley wines and speaks to this phenomenal vintage. Last but certainly not least, we are jumping to the other side of the valley over in the Stag's Leap district with Elizabeth Vianna via Chimney Rock. This is a winery. If you've ever had the pleasure of going down the Silverado Trail and you see that beautiful white winery, that's just that great architecture. Chimney Rock is one of my favorites to see, but they're situated in this gorgeous 120-acre vineyard estate. And with us right now is this beautiful bottling of 2014 Ganymede Vineyard. So I'll show this on here. Elizabeth, you have been with Chimney Rock now since the early 2000s. I know that you made this wine. So talk to me a little bit about this vintage and what you remember from it.
Well, definitely remember the earthquake. That's definitely one of those marking things. But this was I think it was my 10th harvest as winemaker. So I started in 2002. So definitely felt like I was starting to get my stride. Winemaking is a journey, as you know. Definitely remember it being early. We were really used to, especially in Stag's Leap, which is a little cooler, harvesting most of our cab usually in October. And this block was actually harvested on September 29th, and we completed harvest by October 8th that year. So I definitely remember it being unusually early. But like Ivo said, what was beautiful was there were no heat spikes. So even though it was a warm vintage, there was a lot of freshness, really good natural acidity. I really favor wines that are not super ripe. I really like to bring in some of the characters that we get in Stag's Leap, like the dried herbs and the floral, not just sort of fruit driven. So I feel like this wine sort of shows all of those things.
I agree. And I was actually particularly excited to try this wine because it is from the Stag's Leap district, which I have always found in its youth really, can be a little bit more stern, and really appreciates this 10-year mark when things sort of have a minute to be a little bit more cohesive and develop. And I'm curious, since you work so intimately with this region for so long, do you have a similar feeling about Stag's Leap Wine District and specifically the Chimney Rock wines at the 10-year mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Stag's Leap tends to have soft tannins from the get-go. The wines tend to be approachable during age. But and this particular vineyard, Ganymede Vineyard, at the time this wine was made was about 22 years old. So really hitting its stride in terms of producing, extraordinary fruit. But in general, they really have the chops to age. I had a 1985 Chimney Rock the other day out of Magnum, and it was singing. It was a 39-year-old bottle of Cabernet. So they really have like the acidity. And I think people often think of tannin as the thing that's necessary to age, but I think acidity and the play of acidity and tannin is actually quite critical. And being in a cooler spot, we really have the chops to kind of do that. So I love that about Stag's Leap, and I love kind of the nuance that we get here, the floral, the dried herbs, the kind of layers. I really love Cabernet that has layers, and Ganymede certainly is showing that.
Yeah, and I think the age is showing that as well, right? This 10-year mark is a really beautiful place to start to show those layers. There's certainly nothing wrong with a young wine, but sometimes you don't get to see those layers. Sometimes those other things that we love so much about these respective terroirs don't necessarily show in glass until they get to that 10, 15, 20-year mark. So it's exciting to see this now. This wine still has great structure and intensity. And I love that you brought up this idea that you need to have both tannin and acid and fruit as well, for that matter, to really make a wine that is ageable, which all of these wines today certainly are showing potential not only for aging 10 years, but also for much, much longer. I love this question that we have here. What are the main things I should expect when drinking wines with different ages, 10, 20, and 30 years? Would anyone like to take this question?
I mean, it's not different from meeting a human being when they're in their teens and their 20s and their 30s and their 40s. You could think about, I think young wines can be quite opulent and very, open and expressive, and they have, a lot to say. But with the first 10 years, you start to develop some subtlety and some suppleness in the palate. And, maybe a couple of different extra layers from bottle age start to pop up. When you get to 30, that's when you're like multi-layered. You're starting to really get that beautiful bottle bouquet, the suppleness. And I think there's a litheness to wines when they get older, especially Cabernet, which can throw a punch in its youth. It really gets much more elegant and graceful. So that's my metaphor. Think about human beings, and
Yes.
it's not that they're better with age; they're different. And I think when to drink a wine, I think, is also a very personal thing. I think you really have to decide what is your style. And my motto is age it as long as I can resist it. So.
Yeah, I mean, who do you want to hang out with tonight? Is it a 10 or 20 or a 30-year-old person, right? They all have different personalities. Jonathan, you've got way too many old bottles back there for me to not have you answer this question. So I've got to put you on the spot.
Oh, absolutely. It's, for me, it's wines in their youth, especially when you have something that's about 10 years old. It's just starting to kind of come into its own at that point. It's losing that youthfulness that it first had when it was first released. And then as it continues to age into that 20 to 30 range, you're getting a little bit more elegance and refined tannins. And it's also, you can see in more difficult vintages, you can see that the wine becomes more unbalanced as it gets older as well. But in those great vintages where wines are really balanced and incredible when they're young, they're going to drink incredibly well as they age as well.
I agree. It's so interesting. We've talked a lot about the 13 and the 15 vintage as sort of bookending the 14 vintage, but man, I mean, we loved the 14 vintage when it came out. And I think this wine is really just showing something so unique and so independent of those 13 and 15 vintages now. I'm super excited to see where it goes. We've got one more question, a more difficult question to answer, and it's certainly one that I've attempted to before. How do I know when a wine needs more aging or could become quote unquote better?
Well,
I think it maybe goes back to what Elizabeth was saying, right? It's not necessarily a function of better.
I completely agree, Elizabeth. Wine goes through period stages, just like we go through our lives. And you have to know yourself as a consumer. What do you like? And it's nice to buy a case of wine and try a bottle a year. So there's absolutely no projections, oh, this wine will be best after 10 or 11 years. It changes, and that's the pleasure of collecting wines. You kind of, you get surprised. Sometimes you don't expect much, and you open this 3-5-year-old Cabernet, you think it's gonna be all spoiled and vinegary, and it's amazing bottle of wine. So why know everything ahead of time? Why not wait for unexpected?
That's right. You don't know where you're going as a human being, and neither do the
Yeah.
wines. So we have to check in on each other every now and then and see how it's going. You brought up a great point. You know, one of the things that we always recommend to people is if you like a wine and you want to have a relationship with it, buy a few bottles. Don't just buy one, buy a couple and check in every now and then. A case is great. 6 bottles, 3 bottles. But if for some reason, you know, that's not in the cards for you, that is what makes something like Open the Cellar so wonderful. That is what makes this a very unique experience, is that you can go back and revisit, and you can do so with great provenance, courtesy of the wineries who are opening their libraries and extending these wines to you. So you can find everything that we had tonight via openthecellar.com. I encourage you to have a peek into that. I will ask Ivo this one last question before we go. Why did Ivo choose not to use malolactic fermentation for this Chardonnay?
So now my uncle passed away 10 months ago, so I can be frank. He always used to say he was black and white, no malolactic, zero. And all our Chardonnays go through small amount of malolactic. And this one, same thing. We have majority malic acid is still in wine, but not all. Just like you shave off these edges, because malic acid can be very sharp too. So the reason there is nothing wrong with to go through malolactic if you have high acidity. Burgundy succeeded with that. Now in Burgundy, due to global warming, we are finding out that these famous estates, they also don't go through full malolactic because they don't have enough acidity. So you have to know your grapes. If you have plenty acid, put it through. If you don't, in Napa Valley, we never have too much acidity, so we preserve it. Some winemakers, they put the Chardonnay through malolactic and then put it back as a tartaric. And so for me, it doesn't make any sense. So, and the proof is in pudding. If you believe this one is beautiful and aging beautiful, then we must be doing something right here.
I definitely think you're doing something right. You know, we've got such great questions here. I don't want to go, so I'll have you guys answer a few more. Sort of going back to this ageability thing, how do you know when it is on the other side of peak? For me, you know, that's when the fruit's gone, maybe the acid's gone, maybe there's a color issue going on. But anyone else have thoughts on when, you know, maybe it was time to drink that wine 10 years ago?
I mean, unfortunately, sometimes you don't know until you open the wine, but then you just open another one and you try again, and maybe that one is more your style or where you want it to be. But again, I think to the point, if you can buy 2 or more bottles, you can kind of watch it as it ages, and then you can always go back and say, I love that producer. I'm going to get a different vintage, and now I kind of know where I like their wines to be.
Yeah, I think there's an academic answer, which is what I just mentioned. You know, maybe there's structurally the wine's not there. Maybe the color has faded to a brown, so it's oxidized. But then there's the other answer, which is, does it taste good to you? And if the answer is no, then yeah, maybe it's on the other side of the peak. And if the answer is yes, then congratulations, you pulled the cork when it was supposed to be. So it really is a very subjective feeling as to when, peak or not peak has happened. John, you've already mentioned decant time. Does anyone else have any feelings on decant time for some of these older vintages? Elizabeth, Ashley, or Evo?
I'm not big on decanting. Also, I like decanting into the glass. I mean, I love a beautiful decanter at the table stylistically, but honestly, my favorite way of tasting wine is poured into the glass and enjoy it over the course of the next few hours. Unless the wine has a lot of sediment or something that you're concerned about. But I also find that, especially if you're tasting a wine that's like 30, 40 years old, they might be a little more fragile. So I actually tend to be a little bit more careful with those older wines.
Yeah, I'm like you. I'm conservative. Unless it really feels like the wine is wound up and needs it, I let it decant in the glass. Ashley or Evo, any thoughts?
I am the same.
Yeah.
I almost never use a decanter.
There's so many misconceptions in our industry. One is that you decant and oxygen goes in, all of a sudden aromas are up. It's chemically, it's not possible. That's such a long process. It doesn't happen in 30 minutes. So it's true when wine is locked in a bottle for 30 years, when you open it and wait 10 minutes, it opens up. But doesn't have to be in the decanter. I again agree with Elizabeth. If there's lots of sediment, you're worried that that last customer will get half a glass of sediment. Yes, that makes sense to decant it, but not for reason that wine will greatly improve in 1 hour in new decanter.
Yeah, I mean, in a small, tight decanter is great. I'm with you, Elizabeth. I think they're really beautiful, and I think some of the pageantry of it is lovely. But I have to tell you, all of these wines I poured directly into glass, and I just enjoyed them and watched them open, and they were all spectacular. I wouldn't have changed a thing. You guys, I know it has been a great, wonderful long harvest, and I cannot thank you enough for taking time out of your very busy schedules, especially this time of year, to join us today. So thank you all very much. We certainly appreciate the wineries allowing you to be here with us. And also we appreciate the wineries extending the offer to open their libraries to those of you who want to jump in and try this 2014 vintage. It is not just these wines available, you guys. There are tons of wines available via openthecellar.com, courtesy of the Napa Valley Vintners. This is something that is super rare. It doesn't happen all the time, so please take advantage. It's only for 1 week until October 21st. So if you're watching this in real time, I encourage you to do that. Until then, make sure that you are drinking the best Napa Valley wines possible, which is really anything that's coming from Napa Valley. And make sure you're buying a few bottles so you can age these, because as you just seen tonight, they can age, they should age, and they're really beautiful when you allow yourself the time to make it happen. Thank you to the Napa Valley Vintners for having me. I'm Amanda McCrossin, and good night and cheers to you all.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.